Recently, Tudor made waves by announcing their P01 or Prototype 1 watch at Baselworld. Now, if you're not too familiar with Rolex/Tudor history, when you look at the watch, you may first think that looks like a Seiko SKX mod, except for the bezel serrations. And you wouldn't be wrong necessarily, because I'm pretty sure these watches are going to be made, the Seiko mods. But if you're a bit more familiar with these watches, they have a very strange history that are linked to Rolex and Tudor going back a few decades. Now, the history of it is really convoluted, so to try to make sense of it, we're going to go back to the future. Now, to the best of my knowledge, based on my research, the first time a watch of this design linked to Rolex and Tudor, Tudor being a sub-brand of Rolex, came about was probably in the mid to late 90s. People started, Rolex collectors started reporting seeing them. Some were sighted in Asia, and eventually, and I think they started popping up on eBay, and eventually the larger auction houses started having them. And the late 90s, early 2000s, and in particular, there was at least one famous or infamous case of an anti-quorum auction for so-called Rolex US Marine prototype. And there was also a Tudor similar version, a Tudor prototype. And long story short, these watches were described as being prototypes from the early 80s. They sold for a lot of money, some more than others, but a shocking amount of money for what they were because they didn't have any linkage to the company. There was no paperwork from Rolex, or there was no documentation from the military saying that these in fact were prototypes. And even though a few people bought them, the general consensus was that these watches were fakes, or as some call them, fantasy watches, where it was custom built for a collector. And that would sort of go with the rumors that they seem to be coming out of Hong Kong or Vietnam. Again, vague rumors based on older watch forum posts. So basically, they popped up on the scene in the late 90s. A lot expressed skepticism, but when the bigger auction houses started carrying them, the interest grew, and a few of them sold for quite a bit of money. But shortly thereafter, I think for the most part, the general consensus was that they were fake watches. Anecdotally, people who picked them up from various sources, they tried to get Rolex to verify the legitimacy of the watch, and they were never able to do so. And I think for the most part, vintage Rolex/Tudor collectors moved on and dismissed the watch. And since the early 2000s, they would still appear for sale at maybe eBay or something like that, but most people viewed them skeptically. And there continued to be rumors that you could get them somewhere in Asia for a lot less money. Eventually, a Japanese company called RXW made versions of their own with the 4 o'clock crown, but those were never represented as anything but RXW watches versus the others, which were branded Rolex or Tudor. And that's basically where we were. They were dismissed as a legitimate watch, when all of a sudden, this past Baselworld, Tudor makes an announcement that, in fact, they claim that the watch is legitimate, it has legitimate history. They showed a prototype, which apparently couldn't be handled, was in a display case, and also in their advertising, they claim that this was a prototype for the US Navy in the late 60s. Now the thing is, both Rolex and Tudor supplied military-issue watches, but the thing with their watches was that they were basically standard Submariner cases, and usually the main modifications were perhaps to the hands, like in a sword hand modification, or fixed lug bars in lieu of spring bars. That was really the extent of the modifications. So when you look at this watch, and in this case, here's the Tudor P01 or Prototype 1, but the concept is the same, you'll see that there are these hinges at 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock, and presumably you have to lift it up, and that would allow you to rotate the bezel, and then you bring them down, and I guess that would close the bezel in place. And again, Tudor state that there was that they received a patent on it in 1968, but ultimately the Navy, I guess, wasn't interested in this design. It's a bit odd because, as I said, they've been supplying military watches already, and it doesn't really make sense why they would make a watch like that, because my understanding is, and again, I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, the watch companies designed watches based on military specifications, not the other way around. I don't, aside from some experimental thing, I don't think it worked where a company came up with a unique design and then they gave it to the military, because I believe the military had pretty specific demands for what they needed, and it would be on to the company to manufacture or design something to that standard. So based on my limited knowledge, that seems like a little bit of an oddity, an odd way of doing things. But regardless, it never came to fruition, and presumably it was mothballed and it was stuck in some storage in one of the Rolex buildings. Now the problem is, in the 90s and 2000s, when this watch, or this version of the watch, was making waves, Rolex refused to verify its legitimacy. There was no military government documentation on it, and it would sort of seem like it would be in their best interest to admit, hey, this really is a watch, or a similar, at least, hey, this is a fake version of a watch that we did prototype back then, or something like that. But they never did that. They just said it wasn't theirs, and ultimately that led to collectors dismissing it as an outright fake. So it was really surprising when they released and announced, it's not released yet, but announced this watch. Now, aside from some big auction house sales, you can still buy this watch, at least in the Tudor, fake Tudor version. Here's a shot from a website that has them and has other fake vintage watches that you can apparently order from. So there's still like some sort of, I guess, tooling available, and people still manufacture this watch. But it is a little bit odd. I will say that if you compare the new Tudor prototype, rather their original prototype that they say is from the 60s, to the known fakes that are being sold, or even any of the antiquarian sales ones, they look somewhat different. But the one thing I can't really reconcile is, I've been trying to find the patent that they say they had from 1968 about the hinged bezel. I've been using Patent Scope, which allows you to search for patents in different countries, and I've not been able to find anything like that. And I contacted Tudor via social media asking if they could give me a patent number on that, and I never heard anything back. So again, me saying this, I'm not trying to say that Tudor are being dishonest or anything like that. I'm trying to figure out the history. So much of the history behind this particular watch design has been questionable. There's such a shock that the company will officially, suddenly, after all of these decades, come out and say, hey, this really is ours, is really shocking. But again, the thing is, collectors have already moved on. The watch has already been written off, and my understanding is the watch really isn't this new watch, aside from being controversial, isn't really popular with any particular group. So it would be nice if Tudor/Rolex could shed more light on this particular watch. It would, I think, help people put together what the real history of it is. It's just an interesting idea that they in fact produced a watch like this in the late 60s, and there was a patent or some sort of design available, and the idea that someone, say, copied it in the 90s and produced those types of watches that were ultimately counterfeits yet sold for a lot of money at auction, it's an interesting yet dubious history, but it would at least allow collectors to sort of close the book, finish the chapter on that particular watch, which I guess with the Tudor's announcement takes you closer there, but it really would be nice if they could supply the patent and perhaps a little bit more history. And that's really where we stand with this, and that's about it for this video, and as usual, thanks for watching.